A Knight's Gambit. When her father was accused of treason, Lady Isolde of Hymir had no choice but to seek help from Sir Aldrich Ravenshade, the very knight who had sworn to bring her family to ruin. She swallowed her pride, kneeling before him. "Name your price," she whispered. He smirked, stepping closer. "Be careful, my lady," he murmured. "I might take more than you are willing to give." Chapter 1. The Accusation of Treason. The parchment felt cold and brittle in Isolde's trembling hands, the royal seal of King Edric a crimson stain against the stark white. The words, penned in the sharp, unforgiving script of the royal scribe, swam before her eyes, blurring with the unshed tears that threatened to spill. Treason. The word echoed in the sudden silence of her father's solar, a death knell for everything she held dear. Lord Alaric of Hymir, her father, stood accused of conspiring with the rebellious northern lords, of plotting to overthrow the king. The evidence, the letter claimed, was irrefutable. Intercepted correspondence, sworn testimonies from disgruntled servants, and a damning ledger detailing clandestine meetings and illicit funds. Isolde lowered the parchment, her gaze sweeping the familiar room. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the rich tapestries depicting scenes of Hymir's proud history, the polished oak table where her father conducted his affairs, the worn leather-bound books lining the shelves. It was a scene of order, of stability, of a life built on loyalty and service to the crown. And yet, this single piece of parchment threatened to shatter it all. Her father, a man of unwavering honor and steadfast devotion to the king, stood by the hearth, his face ashen, his usually vibrant blue eyes clouded with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He was a tall, imposing figure, his broad shoulders still carrying the strength of a warrior, though his dark hair was now streaked with silver. The lines etched around his mouth and eyes spoke of years spent in service to the realm, of battles fought and won, of unwavering loyalty to the crown. "It's a lie," he finally said, his voice hoarse, breaking the suffocating silence. "A fabrication orchestrated by my enemies." Isolde knew he spoke the truth. Her father was many things stubborn, proud, even a little too fond of his own counsel, but he was no traitor. He had served King Edric faithfully for decades, shedding blood and risking his life countless times for the realm. This accusation was a cruel jest, a twisted machination of courtly politics. "Who would do this, father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who would dare accuse you of such a heinous crime?" Lord Alaric's jaw tightened. "There are many who envy Hymir's prosperity, its influence," he said, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the hearth. "Lord Barrington has long coveted our lands. And the Queen, she has never forgiven me for opposing her marriage to Edric." The Queen. Isolde's stomach clenched. Queen Lyra was a formidable woman, known for her sharp wit, her ambition, and her ruthless pursuit of power. She had never forgiven Lord Alaric for publicly questioning her suitability as queen, citing her foreign lineage and her rumored involvement in the death of her first husband. "But surely the king," Isolde began, her voice trailing off. King Edric was a just and honorable man, but he was also deeply under the queen's influence. Her father shook his head, a grim resignation settling over his features. "Edric is a good man, but he is weak when it comes to Lyra. She has poisoned his mind against me, and now she has her chance to destroy me." Despair washed over Isolde, a cold wave threatening to drown her. She knew the consequences of a treason accusation. Imprisonment, torture, a public execution. The loss of Hymir, their ancestral home, their lands, their titles. Everything they had built, everything they were, would be stripped away. She looked at her father, his proud shoulders slumped, his spirit seemingly broken. A fierce protectiveness surged through her, a desperate need to shield him from the storm that was about to engulf them. She would not let them be destroyed. She would fight. But how? They were surrounded by enemies, powerful figures at court who would stop at nothing to see Hymir fall. She was but a woman, in a world where men held all the power. Her options were limited, her resources meager. Suddenly, a name, a flicker of a possibility, ignited in the darkness of her despair. Sir Aldrich Ravenshade. The very name sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. He was the king's most trusted knight, renowned for his unwavering loyalty, his ruthless efficiency, and his hatred for her family. The Ravenshades and the Hymers had been bitter rivals for generations, their feud a bloody tapestry woven with land disputes, broken alliances, and countless acts of vengeance. Aldrich Ravenshade, the current head of his house, had sworn an oath to bring Hymer to its knees, to avenge the perceived wrongs inflicted upon his ancestors. He was the last person Isolde would ever turn to for help. But he was also, perhaps, their only hope. He held the king's ear, his influence undeniable. If anyone could sway Edric, could convince him of her father's innocence, it was him. The thought of approaching him, of begging for his mercy, was galling. It was a humiliation she could scarcely imagine. But the alternative was unthinkable. She would swallow her pride, endure any indignity, if it meant saving her father and Hymer. She rose, her trembling legs surprisingly steady. "I will go to him," she said, her voice firm, though her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I will go to Sir Aldrich Ravenshade and plead for his help." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, and was that a flicker of hope? "Isolde, you cannot. He despises us. He would sooner see you dead than lift a finger to aid us." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I have nothing to lose, and everything to gain." She straightened her shoulders, summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I will go to him, father, and I will find a way to make him listen." The air hung cold, a bite in the crisp morning. The sun was doing its very best, but the stone beneath her feet remained chilled. Her resolve, however, was not. Chapter 2. The Ravenshade's Shadow. The journey to Ravenshade Keep was a grim reflection of Isolde's inner turmoil. The once familiar landscape, usually vibrant with the colors of late summer, seemed muted, shrouded in a perpetual twilight. The rolling hills, the dense forests, the sparkling rivers all seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the storm that was brewing. Isolde rode with a small escort of her father's most trusted men-at-arms, their faces grim, their hands never far from their swords. They were loyal, seasoned warriors, but even their presence offered little comfort. They were traveling into enemy territory, to the very heart of the Ravenshade power, and they all knew the risks. The keep itself was a stark, imposing structure, built on a craggy outcrop overlooking the turbulent North Sea. Its gray stone walls seemed to meld with the perpetual mist that clung to the cliffs, giving it an almost ethereal, ghostly appearance. Unlike Hymer, with its warm, inviting courtyards and gardens, Ravenshade Keep was a fortress, built for war, its every stone whispering of strength and defiance. As they approached the massive iron gates, Isolde felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The Ravenshade banner, a black raven with outstretched wings against a field of blood red, snapped in the wind, a stark reminder of the family's fierce reputation. The gates creaked open, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity. Men at arms drilled with swords and spears, their movement sharp and precise. Blacksmiths hammered at glowing metal, the clang of their tools echoing against the stone walls. Servants scurried about, their faces wary, their eyes darting nervously towards Isolde and her escort. A tall, stern-faced man, clad in the black and red livery of House Ravenshade, approached them. He was the captain of the guard, Isolde guessed, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "State your business," he demanded, his voice cold and devoid of welcome. "I am Lady Isolde of Hymer," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I seek an audience with Sir Aldrich Ravenshade." The captain's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her, judging her. He clearly recognized her, and the name of Hymer was like a spark to dry tinder. "Sir Aldrich is not expecting visitors," he said, his tone dismissive. Isolde held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "He will see me," she said, her voice laced with a quiet authority that surprised even herself. Tell him it is a matter of life and death. Tell him it concerns Lord Alaric of Hymir. The captain hesitated, his eyes flickering with a flicker of something. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps apprehension. The feud between the two houses was legendary, and the sudden appearance of a Hymir at Ravenshade Keep was unprecedented. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Wait here," he said, turning and disappearing into the keep. Isolde waited, her heart pounding, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak door that had swallowed the captain. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the unseen clock echoing the growing tension in the courtyard. Finally, the door opened, and the captain reappeared. "Sir Aldrich will see you," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Follow me." He led her through a maze of corridors, the air growing colder, the silence deeper. The walls were lined with portraits of Ravenshade ancestors, their stern faces staring down at her, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The scent of damp stone and old wood filled the air, a heavy, oppressive smell that seemed to cling to her clothes. Finally, they reached a large, imposing door, guarded by two heavily armed men. The captain nodded to them, and they swung the door open, revealing a spacious, dimly lit chamber. Sir Aldrich Ravenshade stood by a large, arched window, his back to the door. He was taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the gray light filtering through the glass. He was clad in black leather, his dark hair falling to his shoulders, his posture radiating a quiet, controlled power. The captain announced her presence and then withdrew, closing the door behind him, leaving Isolde alone with the man who had sworn to destroy her family. For a long moment, Aldrich remained silent, his back still turned. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire in the large hearth, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Finally, he turned and Isolde met his gaze. His eyes were the color of the stormy sea outside, a deep, unsettling gray, flecked with silver. They were eyes that had seen much, that held secrets and sorrows, and a chilling intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, but his face was etched with lines of experience, of hardship, of command. There was a hardness to his features, a coldness in his gaze, that spoke of a man who had known little kindness, who had lived his life by the sword. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chamber. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" The sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable, a sharp reminder of the animosity that existed between them. But Isolde refused to be deterred. She had come too far, risked too much, to be cowed by his hostility. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. "I have come to you, Sir Aldrich," she said, her voice clear and steady, "to beg for your help." The silence stretched, the only sound the distant cry of a gull, carried on the sea wind. It seemed to echo the emptiness that suddenly yawned within her, a premonition of the challenge she faced. Chapter 3. A Plea for Mercy. The words hung in the air, stark and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the cold, imposing presence of the night before her. Isolde held her breath, bracing herself for his scorn, his mockery, his outright refusal. Aldrich Ravenshade studied her, his gray eyes unreadable, his expression a mask of cold indifference. He said nothing, merely raised a dark eyebrow, a silent invitation for her to continue. "My father," Isolde began, forcing herself to meet his gaze, to hold it despite the wave of unease that washed over her. "Lord Alaric of Hymir has been accused of treason." The words, spoken aloud in this enemy stronghold, felt like a betrayal, a confession of weakness. But she had no choice. She had to lay bare her family's vulnerability, to appeal to whatever shred of decency, of honor, might reside within this man's heart. Aldrich's expression did not change, but a flicker of something surprise, curiosity, crossed his eyes. He remained silent, waiting. "The accusation is false," Isolde continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by the desperation of her situation. "My father is a loyal servant of the king. He would never betray his oath." And yet, Aldrich finally spoke, his voice a low, smooth rumble that seemed to caress the words. The evidence, I am told, is quite compelling. Evidence that has been fabricated, Isolde countered, her voice rising slightly. By those who seek to destroy him, to destroy Hymir. And who might these enemies be? He asked, a hint of amusement now coloring his tone. Isolde hesitated. To name names, to accuse powerful figures at court, was a dangerous game. But she had come too far to hold back now. Lord Barrington, she said, her voice steady. And the Queen. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of years of rivalry and resentment. Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on her face. He was a predator, she realized, assessing his prey, weighing its strengths and weaknesses, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. They have poisoned the king's mind against my father, Isolde continued, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. They have convinced him that he is a traitor, that he must be punished. And you believe I can change the king's mind? Aldrich asked, his voice laced with skepticism. You are his most trusted knight, Isolde said, her voice pleading. He values your counsel. He listens to you. And why, Aldrich asked, taking a step closer, his shadow falling over her, should I lift a finger to help a Hymir? A family that has been the sworn enemy of my house for generations? The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history, of blood feuds and broken oaths. Isolde knew the answer, or rather, the lack of one. There was no reason, no logical argument that could justify his intervention. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet the intensity of his stare. I have nothing to offer you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. No reward, no compensation. Only my gratitude. A long silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Isolde felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had failed. She had come here, humbled herself before her enemy, and it had all been for naught. Suddenly, Aldrich spoke, his voice surprisingly soft, almost gentle. Gratitude is a fleeting thing, Lady Isolde. Easily given, easily forgotten. He moved closer, his presence filling the room, his scent a mixture of leather, steel, and something wilder, untamed filling her senses. She could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle strength that radiated from him. Look at me, he commanded, his voice a low murmur. She hesitated, then slowly raised her eyes, meeting his gaze. His eyes were no longer cold, indifferent. They were intense, probing, searching for something she couldn't quite decipher. You are willing to do anything to save your father? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question, so unexpected, so loaded with unspoken implications, sent a shiver down her spine. She knew what he was asking, what he was suggesting. The price of his intervention might be far higher than she had ever imagined. But she had come here prepared to pay any price. She had sworn to protect her father, to save Hymir, no matter the cost. Anything, she whispered, her voice trembling, but her gaze unwavering. A flicker of something satisfaction? Triumph? Crossed his eyes. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her. Be careful, my lady, he murmured, his voice a low, seductive whisper. I might take more than you are willing to give. He held her with the power of his stare. The unspoken words that came with that gaze filled the vast chamber. The threat, the promise, the cost. Chapter 4. The bargain is struck. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of his words, his touch, pressing down on Isolde. She stood frozen, caught between fear and a desperate, reckless hope. His eyes, those stormy gray depths, held her captive, drawing her into a dangerous game she didn't fully understand. What do you want? She finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Aldrich's hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, sending a shiver of both apprehension and something else, something she wouldn't, name. He was so close, She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, see the faint stubble on his chin, the subtle pulse beating at the base of his throat. He lowered his gaze, his eyes lingering on her lips, and for a heart-stopping moment, Isolde thought he was going to kiss her. The thought sent a jolt of panic, of forbidden desire, through her. She was here to plead for her father's life, not to engage in some courtly dalliance with her family's sworn enemy. But he didn't kiss her. Instead, he drew back slightly, his hand falling away from her cheek, leaving a lingering coolness in its wake. "I want," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "your cooperation." The word, so seemingly innocuous, sent a chill down her spine. Cooperation. It could mean anything. It could mean everything. "What kind of cooperation?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I will speak to the king," he said, his gaze returning to hers, sharp and assessing. "I will use my influence to cast doubt on the evidence against your father. I will argue for his release, for a fair trial." Hope surged through Isolde, a fragile, tentative thing. It was more than she had dared to hope for, more than she had expected. But she knew, instinctively, that there was more. There was always a price. "And in return?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Aldrich smiled, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. "In return," he said, "you will become my informant." The word struck her like a physical blow. Informant. Spy. Betrayer. I don't understand," she stammered, her mind reeling. "You will remain at court," he explained, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You will observe, you will listen, you will report to me everything you hear. You will be my eyes and ears in the viper's nest that is King Edric's court." Isolde recoiled, her initial hope turning to ashes in her mouth. He was asking her to betray her own people, to become a pawn in his game, to spy on those she had grown up with, those she considered friends, family. "I cannot," she said, her voice shaking. "I will not betray my own." Aldrich's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "You will," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, any pretense of civility. "Or your father will die." The words were a brutal reminder of the stakes, of the power he held over her family's fate. She was trapped, caught between two impossible choices. Betray her father, or betray her own conscience. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She looked at Aldrich, at the man who held her father's life in his hands, and she saw no mercy, no compassion, only a cold, calculating determination. "There must be another way," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. He shook his head, his expression implacable. "There is no other way. This is my price, Lady Isolde. Take it or leave it." She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears, struggling to find a way out, a loophole, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded her. But there was none. She was cornered, her options reduced to a single, agonizing choice. She thought of her father, his proud face, his unwavering loyalty, his love for her. She thought of Hymir, her ancestral home, the place she had sworn to protect. She could not let them be destroyed. She would not. She opened her eyes, meeting Aldrich's gaze, her heart heavy with a mixture of despair and a strange, defiant resolve. "I accept," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm, resolute. "I will do as you ask." A flicker of something satisfaction, triumph crossed his eyes. He nodded, a curt, businesslike gesture. "Good," he said. "Then we have a bargain." He reached out, taking her hand in his grip surprisingly gentle, but firm, unbreakable. "A bargain sealed in blood, Lady Isolde. A bargain you will not break." His grip tightened, a subtle warning, and a new fear pierced the fog of her reluctant agreement. This was no mere political maneuver, this was a pact with the devil himself. Chapter 5. Oaths and Animosity. The weight of the bargain settled upon Isolde like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. She had traded her honor, her loyalty, for her father's life, and the price felt almost unbearable. As she followed Aldrich through the echoing corridors of Ravenshade Keep, back towards the main hall, She felt a profound sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in a world that had suddenly become hostile and treacherous. Aldrich walked beside her, silent, his presence a constant reminder of the pact they had made. He did not touch her, did not speak, but she could feel his gaze upon her, assessing, calculating, always watching. They reached the main hall, a vast, cavernous space filled with the bustle of daily life. Men at arms ate at long wooden tables, their voices echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. Servants scurried about, carrying platters of food and pitchers of ale. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, with smoke and unwashed bodies. Aldrich led her to a small, secluded alcove, away from the noise and activity. A single table stood there, set with 2 goblets and a flagon of wine. He gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, her legs trembling beneath her. He poured them both wine, his movements graceful and precise. He handed her a goblet, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of unexpected awareness through her. She took the goblet, her hand shaking slightly, and took a small sip, the wine tasting bitter on her tongue. "We must discuss the details of our arrangement," Aldrich said, his voice low and serious, his gaze fixed on her face. Isolde nodded, forcing herself to meet his eyes, to hold his gaze despite the turmoil of emotions raging within her. He outlined his expectations, his instructions, his demands. She was to return to court, to resume her duties as a lady in waiting to the queen. She was to observe everything, to listen to every conversation, to report to him any information that might be of use, no matter how seemingly insignificant. "You will be my eyes and ears," he repeated, his voice emphasizing the weight of the responsibility he was placing upon her. "You will report to me regularly, through a trusted intermediary. You will speak to no one of this arrangement." "No one." "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, a flicker of defiance still burning within her. His expression hardened, his eyes turning cold and dangerous. "Then your father will pay the price," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And you will have his death on your conscience." The words were a brutal reminder of her vulnerability, of the power he held over her. She lowered her gaze, defeated, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of his threat. "I understand," she whispered. He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Then we are agreed." He raised his goblet. "To our partnership," he said, his voice laced with a subtle irony. Isolde hesitated, then slowly raised her own goblet, her hand shaking. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of resentment, fear, and a strange, grudging respect. They drank, the wine a bitter symbol of the pact they had made, a pact that bound them together in a dangerous dance of deception and betrayal. As she lowered her goblet, Isolde felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards this man, this enemy, who had forced her into this impossible situation. She hated him, she despised him, and yet she was also strangely drawn to him. He was a formidable man, intelligent, ruthless, undeniably attractive. There was a power about him, a magnetism, that she could not deny. And beneath the cold exterior, she sensed a vulnerability, a hidden pain, that intrigued her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "Why this vendetta against my family? What have we ever done to you?" Aldrich's expression darkened, his eyes clouding with a mixture of anger and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Your family," he said, his voice low and tight, "has stained the honor of mine. They have stolen our lands, betrayed our trust, spilled our blood. For generations, they have sought to destroy us. And I will not rest until I have avenged the wrongs they have inflicted upon us." His words were filled with a raw, visceral pain, a deep-seated hatred that had been passed down through generations. Isolde saw, for the first time, the depth of his animosity, the burden of history that he carried. "But my father," she began, her voice pleading. "He is not responsible for the sins of our ancestors." "He is a Hymir," Aldrich said, his voice hard and unforgiving. "And that is enough." Isolde realized the futility of arguing with him. His hatred was too deeply ingrained, his sense of injustice too profound. She was trapped in a cycle of vengeance, a prisoner of a past she had no part in creating. The weight of old grudges was going to crush her. And she felt her own animosity rising, a mirror of his, fueled by the injustice of her situation, by the threat to her family, by the forced intimacy of their unholy bargain. The very air between them was thick with it, two ancient houses brought to a single point of loathing. She rose to leave, and the chamber doors opened at that precise moment, echoing like the closing of a tomb. Chapter 6. Journey to Blackwood. The journey back to court was a blur of muted landscapes and stifled emotions. Isolde rode in silence, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. The weight of the bargain she had struck with Aldrich pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the dangerous path she had chosen. She replayed their conversation, his words, his touch, his gaze, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue to his true intentions. Was he truly motivated by vengeance, by a desire to destroy her family? Or was there something more, something he was not revealing? The thought sent a shiver of both apprehension and a strange, unsettling excitement through her. She hated him, she despised him, and yet she could not deny the powerful pull he exerted on her, the way her heart raced whenever he was near. She arrived back at court late in the evening, the castle ablaze of lights and activity. The king was hosting a banquet, and the great hall was filled with music, laughter, and the clatter of dishes. Isolde slipped unnoticed through a side entrance, avoiding the crowds, her mind far from the festivities. She made her way to her chambers, a small, sparsely furnished room in the west wing of the castle. She dismissed her maid, needing to be alone, to process the events of the past few days, to steel herself for the role she was about to play. She changed into a simple gown, the rich fabric feeling foreign against her skin after the rough traveling clothes she had worn. She sat by the window, gazing out at the darkened courtyard, her thoughts consumed by the task ahead. She had to be careful, to be discreet, to avoid arousing suspicion. She had to play the part of the loyal lady-in-waiting, while secretly gathering information for her family's sworn enemy. It was a dangerous game, a tightrope walk between loyalty and betrayal. The next morning, Isolde presented herself to the queen, offering a fabricated excuse for her absence. Queen Lyra, a woman of sharp intelligence and even sharper tongue, accepted her explanation with a dismissive wave of her hand, her mind clearly preoccupied with other matters. Isolde resumed her duties, attending to the queen, accompanying her to meetings, listening to the endless stream of gossip and intrigue that flowed through the court. She observed everything, noted every conversation, every glance, every subtle shift in power. She quickly realized that Aldrich was right. The court was a viper's nest, a breeding ground for conspiracies and betrayals. Lord Barrington, the Queen's closest confidant, was clearly orchestrating the campaign against her father, whispering poison in the King's ear, manipulating events to his advantage. The Queen, Isolde observed, was a complex and enigmatic figure. She was ambitious, ruthless, undeniably intelligent, but she also possessed a vulnerability, a hidden insecurity, that made her susceptible to flattery and manipulation. Isolde found herself caught in a web of conflicting loyalties. She was bound by oath to Aldrich, yet she also felt a growing sense of not affection, but perhaps understanding, for the Queen. She saw the woman behind the mask, the loneliness, the fear, the desperate need for control. Days turned into weeks, and Isolde settled into her new role, becoming a silent observer, a collector of secrets. She sent regular reports to Aldrich through a trusted intermediary, a young stable boy who was unknowingly carrying messages between two enemies. She received no response from Aldrich, no acknowledgement of her efforts, no sign that he even received her reports. The silence was unnerving, adding to the sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in this dangerous game. Then one evening she received a summons. A sealed letter, bearing the black raven seal of House Ravenshade, was delivered to her chambers. Her heart pounded as she broke the seal, her hands trembling. The message was brief, concise. Blackwood Forest. 3 days hence, at dusk, Blackwood Forest, a place of shadows and secrets, a notorious hunting ground for outlaws and rebels. It was a dangerous place, a place where anything could happen. Isolde knew what this meant. Aldrich wanted to meet her in person. The thought sent a wave of both fear and a strange, forbidden excitement through her. She was stepping deeper into the darkness, into a world of intrigue and danger, and she knew there was no turning back. She also knew that it had absolutely nothing to do with her father. She burned the letter, erasing all trace of the summons. As she watched the flames, their dance seemed to mimic the fire in her own heart. Chapter 7. The Secrets of the Keep. The 3 days leading up to the meeting at Blackwood Forest were an agony of anticipation and dread. Isolde went through the motions of her courtly duties, smiling, conversing, playing her part, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Aldrich and the perilous rendezvous that awaited her. She found herself studying the Queen more closely, searching for any clue, any hint of weakness that she could exploit. She observed the subtle dynamics of the court, the shifting alliances, the whispered conspiracies, the constant struggle for power and influence. She learned that Lord Barrington was deeply in debt, his lavish lifestyle exceeding his considerable income. She discovered that the Queen's youngest brother, a dissolute and ambitious young man, was secretly plotting to overthrow the king and seize the throne for himself. She overheard conversations, intercepted letters, pieced together fragments of information, slowly building a picture of the intricate web of deceit and betrayal that surrounded her. She continued to send her reports to Aldrich through the unsuspecting stable boy, but she still received no response, no acknowledgement of her efforts. The silence fueled her anxiety, her uncertainty, her growing sense of isolation. On the day of the appointed meeting, Isolde feigned illness, retiring to her chambers early, complaining of a headache. She waited until nightfall, until the castle was quiet, the corridors deserted. Then, she slipped out of her room, dressed in a dark cloak, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She made her way to the stables, where she had arranged for a horse to be saddled and waiting. She mounted the horse, a sturdy, reliable mare, and rode out of the castle gates, unnoticed by the guards, who were more concerned with keeping watch for external threats than with the movements of a lone lady in waiting. The ride to Blackwood Forest was long and arduous, the night air cold and damp. The forest itself was a dark, forbidding place, its ancient trees looming like ghostly sentinels, their branches intertwined, blocking out the moonlight. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, and the occasional snap of a twig under her horse's hooves. Isolde reached the designated meeting place, a small clearing deep within the forest, just as dusk was settling. She dismounted, tethering her horse to a tree, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She waited, her hand resting on the hilt of a small dagger she had concealed beneath her cloak. She was alone, vulnerable, surrounded by shadows and unknown dangers. The forest seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the arrival of the man she had come to meet. Suddenly, she heard a sound, the soft rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. She turned, her hand tightening on the dagger, her eyes scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the hood of his dark cloak. It was Aldrich. He approached her, his movements silent and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her, judging her. "You came," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to reverberate through the trees. "I had no choice," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. He removed his hood, revealing his face, his features starkly illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. His gray eyes were intense, probing, searching for something she couldn't quite decipher. "You have been busy," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your reports have been informative."
So, he had received them.
Relief washed over Isolde, a brief respite from the fear and anxiety that had been consuming her. "I have done as you asked, she said, her voice gaining strength. I have risked everything. He nodded, a curt, businesslike gesture. And you will continue to do so, he said. Until I tell you otherwise. He reached into his cloak, producing a small, rolled-up parchment. He handed it to her. This contains further instructions, he said. Information I need you to gather. People I need you to observe. Isolde took the parchment, her hand brushing against his, sending a jolt of unexpected awareness through her. She unrolled the parchment, her eyes scanning the list of names, the detailed instructions, the intricate web of deceit he was weaving. The handwriting was sharp, almost angry, with a sense of urgency. As her eyes moved down the page, she saw it. Her own name. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Gallery. The parchment trembled in Isolde's hand, her own name staring back at her, a stark and unsettling anomaly amidst the list of court officials, noble lords, and foreign dignitaries. Her heart skipped a beat, a cold dread creeping into her veins. What is this? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze darting back to Aldrich's face, searching for an explanation, a denial, anything to dispel the sudden fear that had gripped her. Aldrich's expression remained impassive, his gray eyes unreadable, his features set in a mask of cold indifference. He offered no answer, no comfort, only a chilling silence that amplified her unease. Why is my name on this list? She pressed, her voice rising slightly, a tremor of both fear and anger creeping into her tone. What do you want me to observe about myself? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of her growing suspicion. Was he testing her loyalty? Was he playing some cruel game? Or was there something more sinister at play? Aldrich finally spoke, his voice a low, smooth rumble that seemed to caress the words, yet held a chilling undercurrent of menace. You are a woman of secrets, Lady Isolde. Even you must admit that. The words, so seemingly innocuous, sent a shiver down her spine. What secrets did he think she possessed? What had he discovered? Or was this merely a ploy, a tactic to keep her off balance, to control her? I have no secrets from you, she retorted, her voice defiant, though her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. I have told you everything I know. Aldrich smiled, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. Everything you think you know, perhaps, he said, his gaze lingering on her face, his eyes probing, searching, as if trying to unravel the mysteries hidden within her. But there are always things we keep hidden, even from ourselves. His words struck a chord, a deep, unsettling resonance within her. Was he right? Were there things she had buried, forgotten, repressed? Secrets she had unknowingly kept, even from herself? The thought was unnerving, unsettling, casting a shadow of doubt over her own sense of self. She had always considered herself to be honest, forthright, transparent. But now, confronted with Aldrich's cryptic words, she felt a tremor of uncertainty, a flicker of self-doubt. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking slightly.
What do you want from me?
Aldrich took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, his presence filling the small clearing. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her. I want the truth, Isolde, he murmured, his voice a low, seductive whisper. The whole truth. Nothing less. His gaze held hers, locking her in a silent battle of wills. She could feel the intensity of his stare, the weight of his expectations, the unspoken threat that hung in the air. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, caught between her loyalty to her family, her growing sense of unease about Aldrich's intentions, and the strange, forbidden attraction she felt towards him. She was playing a game she didn't fully understand, a game where the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, forcing herself to meet his gaze, to hold it despite the turmoil of emotions raging within her. I will tell you everything I know, she said, her voice firm, resolute, though her heart quaked with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating sense of defiance. But you must tell me the truth as well. You must tell me why my name is on this list. Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something surprise? Respect? Crossing his face. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words, considering her challenge. Finally, he nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture. Very well, he said, his voice low and serious. We have a new bargain, Lady Isolde. A bargain of truth. He stepped back, his hand falling away from her cheek, leaving a lingering coolness in its wake. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, with the weight of their new agreement, with the dangerous game they were about to play. And she was about to play blind, she realized, as the clouds shifted and the already fading moon was completely extinguished. Chapter 9. The Tournament of Lies. The days following the meeting in Blackwood Forest were filled with a heightened sense of tension and uncertainty. Isolde returned to court, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. The new bargain she had struck with Aldrich, the bargain of truth, weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the perilous path she was treading. She continued to observe, to listen, to gather information, sending her reports to Aldrich through the usual intermediary. But now her focus had shifted. She was not only searching for information about others, but also for clues about herself, about the secrets Aldrich believed she possessed. She spent hours poring over old letters, diaries, family records, searching for any hint of something hidden, something forgotten, something that might explain Aldrich's cryptic words. She questioned her old nursemaid, her childhood friends, her distant relatives, probing their memories, seeking any fragment of information that might shed light on her past. But she found nothing. No hidden scandals, no forgotten betrayals, no dark secrets that could justify Aldrich's suspicions. Her past, as far as she could tell, was unremarkable, unblemished, a stark contrast to the turbulent present she now inhabited. Meanwhile, the court was abuzz with preparations for the annual King's Tournament, a grand spectacle of jousting, archery, and melee combat. Knights from across the realm were gathering, eager to prove their skill and valor, to win the king's favor and the coveted prizes. Isolde, despite her inner turmoil, was forced to participate in the festivities, attending to the queen, accompanying her to the various events, playing the part of the loyal lady-in-waiting. She found herself surrounded by pomp and ceremony, by displays of chivalry and honor, that seemed a cruel mockery of the deceit and betrayal that lurked beneath the surface. She observed the knights, their interactions, their rivalries, their ambitions. She saw the way they looked at her, the subtle flirtations, the veiled compliments, the unspoken desires. She realized that she was a pawn in their game, a prize to be won, a means to an end. One knight in particular caught her attention. Sir Gareth of Northwood, a young, handsome, and ambitious knight, renowned for his skill with a lance and his charming demeanor. He paid her particular attention, showering her with compliments, seeking her company, making his intentions clear. Isolde found herself strangely drawn to him. He was kind, courteous, seemingly honorable, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating Aldrich. He offered her a glimpse of a different life, a life of normalcy, of love, of escape from the dangerous game she was playing. But she knew she could not trust him. She could trust no one. She was surrounded by enemies, by potential betrayers, and she had to be constantly on her guard. The tournament itself was a blur of clashing steel, thundering hooves, and roaring crowds. Isolde watched from the royal box, alongside the queen, her mind far from the spectacle before her. She was searching for Aldrich, for any sign of him, any clue to his intentions. She finally spotted him, standing among the king's guard, his face impassive, his gray eyes scanning the crowd. He did not acknowledge her, did not even look at her, but she could feel his presence, a subtle pressure, a constant reminder of the bargain they had made. As the tournament reached its climax, with the final joust between Sir Gareth and another knight, Isolde noticed something odd. A subtle gesture, a whispered word, a fleeting exchange of glances between Sir Gareth and Lord Barrington. A sudden realization struck her, a chilling premonition. Sir Gareth was not what he seemed. He was not merely a charming knight seeking her favor. He was a pawn in a larger game, a tool of Lord Barrington, and perhaps of Aldrich himself. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The cryptic words, the list, the bargain of truth. It was all a test, a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to expose her, to trap her, to force her to reveal what? The final lances shattered, and a cry of victory, or defeat, tore through the suddenly hushed arena. But for Isolde, it echoed a different sound altogether. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception. The realization that Sir Gareth was likely part of Aldrich's intricate game sent a wave of both anger and fear through Isolde. She felt betrayed, manipulated, used as a pawn in a power struggle she didn't fully understand. But beneath the anger, there was also a flicker of intrigue. Aldrich's methods were ruthless, undeniably, but they were also undeniably effective. He was a master strategist, a puppeteer pulling the strings of the court, and she was caught in his web. She decided to play along, to continue the charade, to see where it would lead. She responded to Sir Gareth's attentions, accepting his compliments, engaging in light banter, allowing him to believe he was winning her over. But all the while, she observed him closely, watching for any slip-up, any hint of his true intentions. She also continued her search for answers about herself, delving deeper into her family history, questioning anyone who might hold a clue to the secrets Aldrich believed she possessed. She discovered a long-forgotten scandal involving her mother, a rumored affair with a foreign nobleman, but the details were vague, the evidence circumstantial. She wondered if this was the secret Aldrich was seeking, the leverage he intended to use against her. But it seemed too insignificant, too distant, to justify his elaborate machinations. There had to be something more, something she was missing. Meanwhile, the court continued its dance of deception, with everyone playing their roles, hiding their true intentions behind masks of civility and honor. The queen, Isolde observed, was becoming increasingly isolated, her paranoia growing, her trust in her advisors dwindling. Lord Barrington continued his machinations, whispering poison in the king's ear, consolidating his power, preparing for his next move. Isolde found herself caught in the middle, navigating the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue, trying to protect her father, uncover Aldrich's true motives, and avoid becoming a casualty of the power struggles that surrounded her. One evening, she received another summons from Aldrich. A brief, cryptic message, delivered by the same stable boy, instructing her to meet him at the old abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the castle grounds. She went, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. The chapel was a crumbling ruin, its stained glass windows shattered, its stone walls overgrown with ivy. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a fitting setting for their clandestine meetings. Aldrich was waiting for her, his face hidden in the shadows of his cloak. He greeted her with a curt nod, his gray eyes unreadable. "You have been playing your part well," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble. "Sir Gareth seems captivated." "He is a fool," Isolde replied, her voice laced with a mixture of disdain and something else. A flicker of jealousy? A hint of resentment at being used as bait? Aldrich smiled, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps," he said, "but a useful fool. He has provided me with valuable information." "Information about what?" Isolde asked, her voice sharp. "About me?" Aldrich's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "About everything," he said. "About the court, about the queen, about the conspiracies that threaten the realm." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face, his eyes probing, searching. "And about your family," he added, his voice barely a whisper. Isolde's heart skipped a beat. What had he discovered? What had Sir Gareth revealed? "What about my family?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Aldrich took a step closer, his presence filling the small chapel. He reached out, his hand touching her arm, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her. "Your mother," he said, his voice a low murmur, "was not who you think she was." Isolde froze. His words hung in the silence. The stone beneath her feet felt cold. Chapter 11. The falcon's flight. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, casting a shadow over everything Isolde thought she knew about her family, her past, her very identity. Her mother, the gentle, loving woman who had died when Isolde was just a child. What secrets had she kept hidden? What darkness lurked beneath the surface of her seemingly idyllic life? What do you mean? Isolde stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her mind reeling with a mixture of disbelief and a growing sense of dread. Aldrich's hand remained on her arm, his touch both a comfort and a threat, a reminder of the power he held over her, the dangerous game they were playing. Your mother, he repeated, his voice low and steady, his gray eyes fixed on her face, was a spy. The word struck Isolde like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs.
A spy.
Her mother, a woman of noble birth, a lady of the court, a spy? It seemed impossible, unbelievable, a cruel jest. That's not true, she protested, her voice shaking, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words. You're lying. Aldrich shook his head, his expression implacable. I have proof, he said. Letters, documents, testimonies. Evidence that your mother was working for the Northern Lords, for the enemies of the king, for years before her death. He reached into his cloak, producing a small, leather-bound packet. He handed it to her. Isolde took the packet, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Letters written in her mother's elegant hand, detailing troop movements, court intrigues, secret alliances documents bearing the seal of the Northern Lords, acknowledging her mother's services, sworn testimonies from former servants, confirming her clandestine meetings, her secret correspondence. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, undeniable. Her mother, the woman she had idolized, the woman she had believed to be a paragon of virtue, had been a traitor. Tears welled in Isolde's eyes, blurring her vision. She felt a wave of nausea, of betrayal, of profound grief. Her world had been shattered, her illusions destroyed, her very foundations shaken. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice choked with emotion, her gaze darting back to Aldrich's face, searching for some sign of compassion, some explanation for his cruelty. Aldrich's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy crossing his face. Because you deserve to know the truth, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. And because I need your help. Isolde stared at him, bewildered, confused. My help? How can I possibly help you? Your mother was not the only spy, he said. There are others, still active at court, working for the same enemies. I need you to find them, to expose them, to help me bring them to justice. He was asking her to follow in her mother's footsteps, to become a spy herself, to betray her own people, just as her mother had done. It was a cruel irony, a twisted twist of fate. But he was also offering her a chance at redemption, a way to atone for her mother's sins, to clear her family's name, to prove her loyalty to the king. I don't know, she stammered, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I need time to think. Aldrich nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need, he said. But know this, Isolde. The fate of the realm and the fate of your family may depend on your decision. He turned to leave, disappearing into the shadows of the ruined chapel, leaving Isolde alone with her shattered illusions, her broken heart, and the weight of a decision that could change everything. Outside, beyond the crumbling walls, a falcon took flight, its silhouette a dark slash against the fading light of the setting sun. Isolde watched it, a faint sense of hope stirring within her, fragile as a bird's wing. And just as fragile as the new and dangerous idea growing in her mind. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past. The revelation of her mother's treachery left Isolde reeling, adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Grief, anger, betrayal, confusion, they swirled within her, threatening to overwhelm her. She retreated to her chambers, seeking solace in solitude, trying to make sense of the shattered fragments of her past. She spent hours poring over the documents Aldrich had given her, reading and rereading her mother's letters, searching for some clue, some explanation, some hint of the woman she thought she knew. She found nothing but cold, hard evidence of deceit and betrayal, a stark contrast to the loving, gentle mother she remembered. She tried to reconcile the two images, the loving mother and the treacherous spy, but they refused to merge. They remained separate, distinct, irreconcilable. She felt as if she had lost her mother all over again, this time not to death, but to a truth that was far more devastating. As the days passed, Isolde's grief gradually gave way to a steely resolve. She would not be defined by her mother's sins. She would not allow her family's name to be forever tarnished by the stain of treachery. She would find a way to redeem herself, to prove her loyalty, to forge her own path. She decided to accept Aldrich's offer, to become his informant, his spy, his weapon against the enemies of the realm. It was a dangerous game, a betrayal of her own people, but it was also a chance to atone for her mother's sins, to protect her father, to save Hymir. She sent a message to Aldrich through the usual intermediary, agreeing to his terms. She received no reply, no acknowledgement, but she knew he would be waiting, watching, expecting her to fulfill her part of the bargain. She returned to court, resuming her duties as a lady-in-waiting, but with a new purpose, a new determination. She observed everything, listened to every conversation, gathered every scrap of information, searching for the spies Aldrich had spoken of, the hidden enemies who threatened the king. She found herself drawn into a world of shadows and secrets, of whispered conspiracies and covert meetings, of coded messages and hidden agendas. She learned to decipher the subtle cues, the unspoken words, the veiled threats that passed between the courtiers, the nobles, the foreign dignitaries. She discovered that Lord Barrington was not only deeply in debt, but also in league with the rebellious northern lords, plotting to overthrow the king and seize the throne for himself. She learned that the queen's brother was not only ambitious, but also ruthless, willing to betray anyone, even his own family, to achieve his goals. She uncovered a network of spies, a web of deceit that stretched across the court, reaching into the highest levels of power. She realized that her mother had been just one small piece of a much larger, much more dangerous conspiracy. As she delved deeper into this world of shadows, Isolde found herself changing, transforming. She became more cautious, more observant, more ruthless. She learned to lie, to deceive, to manipulate, to use others for her own purposes. She hated what she was becoming, but she also knew that it was necessary, that she had to adapt to survive, to protect herself and her family. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between loyalty and betrayal, between honor and necessity, between the woman she once was and the woman she was becoming. She was scarred, not physically, but emotionally. The wounds of the past, reopened by the truth of her mother, would not close easily. But tonight, a new one was added. The wound of her own choice. Chapter 13. Revelations by Firelight. Weeks turned into months, and Isolde became increasingly adept at her role as a spy. She moved through the court like a shadow, unseen, unheard, gathering information, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy that threatened the realm. She sent regular reports to Aldrich, detailing her findings, identifying the key players, exposing their plans. She still received no direct communication from him, only occasional cryptic messages, delivered through the stable boy, acknowledging her reports and providing further instructions. The silence was unnerving, but she had grown accustomed to it, accepting it as part of the dangerous game they were playing. One evening, as a fierce storm raged outside, battering the castle walls with wind and rain, Isolde received another summons. A hastily scrawled note, bearing the Black Raven seal, instructing her to meet Aldrich in the abandoned library, a rarely used chamber deep within the castle's oldest wing. She made her way through the darkened corridors, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the rain drumming against the leaded glass windows. The castle seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the storm both outside and within. The library was a vast, cavernous space, filled with rows upon rows of ancient books, their leather bindings cracked and faded, their pages yellowed with age. The air was thick with a smell of dust and decay, a testament to years of neglect. Aldrich was waiting for her, standing by a large fireplace where a small fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He was dressed in his usual black, his face illuminated by the firelight, his gray eyes intense and unreadable. "You have done well," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Your information has been invaluable." Isolde nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had proven herself, she had fulfilled her part of the bargain, but she knew there was more to come. "The conspiracy is deeper than I imagined," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Lord Barrington is the mastermind, but he has many allies, both within the court and beyond." Aldrich nodded, his expression grim.
"I know," he said.
"And the time is fast approaching when we must act." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face, his eyes searching, probing. "There is one more thing I need from you, Isolde," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Isolde's heart skipped a beat. What more could he possibly want? What further risks was he going to ask her to take? "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Aldrich took a step closer, his presence filling the room, his scent a mixture of leather, wood smoke, and something wilder, untamed filling her senses. "I need you to betray someone you trust," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. "Someone close to the Queen. Someone who holds the key to exposing the entire conspiracy." Isolde stared at him, bewildered, confused.
Who was he talking about?
Who did she trust that was also close to the Queen? Then it struck her. A sudden, chilling realization. He was talking about herself. "You want me to betray myself?" she stammered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Aldrich smiled, a slow, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes.
"Not exactly," he said.
"But you are the key, Isolde. You are the one who can bring them all down." He explained his plan, a daring, intricate scheme that involved using Isolde's position as a lady-in-waiting, her access to the Queen, her knowledge of the court, to expose the conspirators, to lure them into a trap, to bring them to justice. It was a dangerous plan, a reckless gamble, that could cost Isolde her life. But it was also the only way to stop the conspiracy, to save the king, to protect the realm. I don't know," she stammered, her mind reeling with the implications of his words. "It's too risky." Aldrich reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her. "I know it's risky, Isolde," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But I believe in you. I know you can do this." His gaze held hers, locking her in a silent battle of wills. She could feel the intensity of his stare, the weight of his expectations, the unspoken trust he was placing in her. She looked for deceit, but saw only his confidence. And beneath the fear, the uncertainty, she felt a surge of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of being part of something larger than herself. "All right," she said at last. "Tell me what to do." The fire crackled, its warmth a sudden contrast to the chilling nature of the plan that began to unfold. Tonight, a new path would be forged, a new self revealed. Chapter 14. The Price of Loyalty. The details of Aldrich's plan were intricate and audacious, requiring Isolde to play a dangerous game of double bluff, manipulating those around her while maintaining the facade of a loyal lady-in-waiting. She was to feign sympathy for Lord Barrington's cause, subtly encouraging his rebellion, while secretly gathering evidence of his treachery and preparing the ground for his downfall. The risk was immense. If she were discovered, the consequences would be dire imprisonment, torture, execution. But Isolde was committed. She had embraced her role as a spy, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Isolde meticulously executed Aldrich's plan. She cultivated a closer relationship with Lord Barrington, pretending to share his discontent with the king, hinting at her own disillusionment with the court. She carefully planted seeds of doubt in the Queen's mind, subtly undermining her trust in Barrington, while simultaneously feeding Barrington false information, leading him to believe he had the Queen's support. It was a delicate dance, a constant balancing act between truth and lies, loyalty and betrayal. Isolde found herself increasingly isolated, her true motives hidden behind a mask of deception. She could trust no one, confide in no one, her only confidant the silent, enigmatic Aldrich, who remained a distant, shadowy figure, pulling the strings from afar. She received occasional messages from him, delivered in the usual clandestine manner, offering guidance, encouragement, and warnings. She sensed a growing respect in his tone, a recognition of her skill and courage, but also a detachment, a reminder that she was merely a tool in his larger game. One evening, as Isolde was preparing for a grand ball hosted by the Queen, she received a particularly disturbing message from Aldrich. He warned her that Barrington was becoming suspicious, that he was starting to question her loyalty, that he was planning to test her. Isolde's heart pounded with fear. She knew that if Barrington discovered her true intentions, she would be lost. She had to be more careful, more cunning, more ruthless. The ball was a lavish affair, the great hall filled with music, laughter, and the swirling colors of silk and velvet gowns. Isolde moved through the crowd, her senses on high alert, her mind racing, searching for any sign of danger, any hint of Barrington's suspicions. She danced with Sir Gareth, who continued to play the part of the smitten admirer, oblivious to the dangerous game she was playing. She exchanged pleasantries with the Queen, who seemed increasingly agitated and paranoid, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She finally spotted Lord Barrington, standing in a corner, his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. He approached her, his movements smooth and graceful, his smile a mask of false charm. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice a low murmur, "you look radiant tonight." "Thank you, my lord," she replied, forcing a smile, her heart pounding against her ribs. He offered her his arm, inviting her to dance. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted, knowing that she had no choice. This was the test Aldrich had warned her about. As they danced, Barrington steered her towards a secluded alcove, away from the noise and the crowds. He stopped, his gaze intense, his hand tightening on her arm. "I have heard rumors, Lady Isolde," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Rumors that you are not as loyal to our cause as you pretend to be." Isolde's heart skipped a beat. He knew, or at least he suspected. She had to think fast, to find a way to convince him of her loyalty, to dispel his suspicions. "Rumors are often spread by those who seek to undermine us, my lord," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am as committed to our cause as you are." Barrington's eyes narrowed, his gaze searching, probing.
"Prove it," he said.
Isolde's mind raced. What could she do? What could she say? How could she prove her loyalty without betraying Aldrich, without jeopardizing the entire plan? Then it came to her. A desperate gamble, a reckless act of defiance, but the only way to save herself, to save the plan. She leaned closer to Barrington, her voice a seductive whisper. "I have information, my lord," she said. "Information that could bring down the king. But it comes at a price." She held her breath. Barrington's answering smile was as cold as death, yet it contained a flicker of triumph. The trap was sprung. But who was caught? Chapter 15. A Knight's Confession. The price Isolde demanded was audacious, a calculated risk designed to both allay Barrington's suspicions and further Aldrich's plan. She requested a private meeting with Barrington, alone, in his chambers, under the guise of sharing sensitive information that could only be entrusted in the utmost secrecy. Barrington, his ego and ambition overriding his caution, readily agreed. He saw this as an opportunity to solidify Isolde's allegiance, to bind her to his cause, and to gain access to the valuable intelligence she supposedly possessed. He was playing into her hands, walking blindly into the trap she and Aldrich had carefully laid. The meeting was set for the following evening. Isolde spent the intervening hours in a state of heightened anxiety, rehearsing her lines, preparing for the dangerous encounter. She knew that one wrong word, one false move, could betray her, leading to her imprisonment or worse. She met with Aldrich, one last time, in the abandoned chapel. He listened intently as she outlined her plan, his gray eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Isolde," he said, his voice low and serious. "Barrington is a dangerous man. He will not hesitate to kill you if he suspects your treachery." "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I have no choice. This is the only way." Aldrich nodded, a flicker of something that might have been admiration crossing his face. He reached out, his hand touching her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I trust you, Isolde," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know you will not fail." His words, so unexpected, so unlike his usual cold detachment, sent a surge of warmth through her. She realized that, despite everything, she had earned his respect, his trust, and perhaps something more. The following evening, Isolde made her way to Barrington's chambers, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She was dressed in a simple gown, her hair unbound, her only weapon the dagger concealed beneath her cloak and the quickness of her wit. Barrington greeted her with a predatory smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of lust and suspicion. He dismissed his servants, ensuring their privacy, then led her to a small, secluded sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. "Now, Lady Isolde," he said, his voice smooth and seductive, "tell me what secrets you have brought me." Isolde took a deep breath, steeling herself for the performance of her life. She recounted a fabricated tale of court intrigues, of secret alliances, of the king's growing weakness and vulnerability. She embellished the story with details she had gleaned from her observations, weaving a web of deceit that was both plausible and compelling. Barrington listened intently, his eyes gleaming with excitement, his ambition fueled by her words. He believed her. He trusted her. He saw her as a valuable asset in his plot to overthrow the king. As Isolde continued her fabricated tale, she subtly steered the conversation towards the planned rebellion, encouraging Barrington to reveal his plans, to expose his allies, to incriminate himself. He did so willingly, boasting of his strength, his influence, his imminent victory. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside the chamber. Barrington jumped, startled, his hand reaching for his sword. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Before Isolde could answer, the door burst open, and Aldrich stormed into the room, his sword drawn, his face a mask of fury. He was followed by a squad of the king's guard, their weapons at the ready. "Lord Barrington," Aldrich roared, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you are under arrest for treason." Barrington stared at Aldrich, then at Isolde, his eyes widening with disbelief, then with rage. He realized he had been betrayed, tricked, outmaneuvered. You witch!" he snarled at Isolde, his hand tightening on his sword. "You set me up." Before Barrington could react, before he could draw his sword, Aldrich lunged, his blade flashing in the firelight. The two men engaged in a brief, furious struggle, the clang of steel echoing through the room. Aldrich, despite his age, was the stronger, more skilled swordsman. He quickly disarmed Barrington, forcing him to his knees, his sword at his throat. "It's over," Barrington, Aldrich said, his voice cold and hard. "Your treason is exposed. Your rebellion is crushed." The king's guards seized Barrington, binding his hands, dragging him from the room. He glared at Isolde, his eyes filled with hatred and a promise of revenge. Isolde stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. It was over. The plan had succeeded. Barrington was defeated. The realm was safe. Aldrich turned to her, his expression softening, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked a great deal like gratitude. And perhaps something warmer. "Are you all right?" he asked her. And for the first time, she heard his true voice. The knight's voice, raw and full of honest emotion. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. The arrest of Lord Barrington sent shockwaves through the court. The news of his treachery, his planned rebellion, spread like wildfire, creating a climate of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. The Queen, initially disbelieving, was devastated by the betrayal of her closest confidant. She retreated into her chambers, refusing to see anyone, her paranoia and isolation deepening. The king, emboldened by Barrington's capture and the thwarting of the conspiracy, asserted his authority, ordering a thorough investigation into the plot, seeking out any remaining conspirators, purging the court of disloyal elements. Isolde, hailed as a heroine for her role in exposing Barrington, found herself thrust into the limelight, showered with praise and gratitude. The king rewarded her with titles, lands, and a position of influence at court. But the accolades felt hollow, the rewards meaningless. She had played her part, she had saved the realm, but at a great cost. She had betrayed her own conscience, she had manipulated those around her, she had become a deceiver, a spy, a woman she no longer recognized. The victory felt bittersweet, tainted by the darkness of the methods she had employed. Aldrich, too, was lauded for his role in uncovering the conspiracy. He was promoted to the head of the King's Guard, his power and influence further consolidated. He remained distant, enigmatic, his true feelings hidden behind a mask of duty and honor. Isolde rarely saw him, their interactions limited to brief, formal encounters in the corridors of the castle. He acknowledged her presence with a curt nod, a fleeting glance, but there was no warmth, no intimacy, no acknowledgement of the dangerous game they had played together, the bond they had forged. She wondered if he regretted involving her, if he saw her as a mere tool, a pawn in his larger game. She wondered if he felt any guilt for the burden he had placed upon her, the scars he had inflicted on her soul. Despite the outward calm, a storm was brewing beneath the surface. The remnants of Barrington's conspiracy, though scattered and disorganized, were still active, plotting their revenge, seeking to destabilize the realm. The Northern Lords, emboldened by Barrington's rebellion, were growing increasingly restless, their threat looming large on the horizon. Isolde, despite her desire to retreat from the world of intrigue and deception, found herself drawn back into the fray. She received cryptic messages, warning of impending attacks, of secret plots, of renewed threats to the king and the realm. She realized that the game was not over, that the danger was far from past. She had a duty, a responsibility, to use her knowledge, her skills, her hard-won experience, to protect the realm, to finish what she had started. She sought out Aldrich, requesting a private meeting. He granted her request, summoning her to his chambers, a stark, sparsely furnished room in the heart of the castle's fortifications. He greeted her with his usual reserve, his gray eyes unreadable, his expression a mask of cold detachment. But as she recounted the threats she had uncovered, the dangers that loomed, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of concern, a hint of respect, a glimmer of the shared understanding that had forged their unlikely alliance. "We must act quickly," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "The Northern Lords are planning an invasion. They are gathering their forces, preparing to strike." Aldrich nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "My scouts have confirmed your information. We are facing a war." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face, his eyes searching, probing. "And you, Isolde," he said, his voice low and serious, "will be at the heart of it." It wasn't a question. The acknowledgement of what she had become, what they had both become, hung between them. The gathering storm was not just outside the castle walls. It was also raging within. Chapter 17. Siege and Surrender. The news of the impending northern invasion plunged the court into a state of controlled chaos. Preparations for war began in earnest, the castle bustling with activity. Men at arms drilled in the courtyard, blacksmiths hammered out swords and armor, provisions were stockpiled, and defenses were strengthened. Isolde, despite her lack of military experience, found herself drawn into the preparations, her knowledge of the Northern Lords, their strategies, their weaknesses, proving invaluable. She advised the king's council, offering insights, suggesting strategies, helping to coordinate the defense of the realm. She worked closely with Aldrich, their relationship shifting from that of reluctant allies to one of mutual respect and shared purpose. They spent hours poring over maps, discussing tactics, planning for every contingency. The formality between them gradually eroded, replaced by a quiet understanding, a shared burden, a bond forged in the crucible of impending war. Aldrich, she discovered, was not the cold, unfeeling man she had initially believed him to be. Beneath the harsh exterior, beneath the layers of duty and honor, there was a vulnerability, a deep-seated pain, a longing for connection. She saw glimpses of it in his eyes, in the subtle softening of his expression when he spoke of his past, of his lost love, of the burdens he carried. She, in turn, found herself opening up to him, sharing her own fears, her own doubts, her own guilt over the role she had played in the deception and betrayal that had preceded the war. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that transcended their past animosity, their conflicting loyalties, their vastly different backgrounds. The Northern Army, led by the ruthless and ambitious Lord Rylan, a distant cousin of Lord Barrington, arrived sooner than expected, laying siege to the castle. The battle was fierce and brutal. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying, the thunder of siege engines echoing through the halls of the castle. Isolde, refusing to remain hidden within the safety of the castle walls, insisted on contributing to the defense. She tended to the wounded, organized supplies, and even, on one desperate occasion, took up a bow and arrow, defending a breach in the walls alongside the men-at-arms. The siege lasted for weeks, the defenders growing increasingly weary, their supplies dwindling, their hope fading. The castle walls were breached in several places, the enemy threatening to overrun the defenses. It seemed as if all was lost. Then, on the darkest night of the siege, as the defenders prepared for a final, desperate stand, Aldrich came to Isolde, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked a great deal like despair. "It's over, Isolde," he said, his voice low and heavy. "We cannot hold out any longer. We must surrender." Isolde stared at him, disbelief warring with a growing sense of dread. Surrender? To the Northern Lords? To the man who had sworn to destroy her family? It was unthinkable, unacceptable. "No," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "We cannot surrender. We must fight. We must find a way." Aldrich shook his head, his expression filled with a weary sadness. "There is no way, Isolde," he said. "We are outnumbered, outmatched. Further resistance will only lead to more bloodshed, more death." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face, his eyes searching, pleading. "I will not let you die, Isolde," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I will negotiate terms. I will ensure your safety." His words, so unexpected, so filled with a raw, unguarded emotion, struck Isolde to the core. She realized, with a sudden, blinding clarity, that he cared for her, that he loved her, that he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. And in that moment, holding his gaze across the room, she realized, too, that she loved him. She reached out, touching his hand. "Then we surrender together," she said. The words were a promise and a beginning. And as the dawn rose, a strange and terrible peace settled over the castle. Chapter 18. Blood and Forgiveness. The surrender of the castle was a bitter pill to swallow, a humiliation that stung Isolde's pride and fueled her fears. She watched as the northern banners replaced the king's colors on the ramparts, as Lord Ryland's men swarmed through the halls, their faces triumphant, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and lust. Aldrich, true to his word, negotiated terms of surrender that ensured the safety of the king, the queen, and the remaining defenders. He insisted on a clause guaranteeing Isolde's protection, shielding her from Ryland's vengeance, securing her freedom. But the price of that freedom was high. Aldrich himself was taken prisoner, branded a traitor for his role in Barrington's downfall, and subjected to Ryland's cruel whims. Isolde watched, helpless and heartbroken, as he was stripped of his rank, his armor, his dignity, and led away in chains. She was allowed to remain in the castle, a gilded cage, her movements restricted, her every action monitored. She was treated with a mixture of suspicion and disdain by Ryland's men, who saw her as a symbol of the fallen regime, a reminder of their victory. She spent her days in a state of quiet despair, haunted by the image of Aldrich in chains, by the knowledge that he had sacrificed himself to save her. She longed to see him, to speak to him, to offer him some comfort, some hope, but she was denied access, forbidden to approach him. Then, one evening, she received a secret summons. A young serving girl, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sympathy, slipped a note into Isolde's hand, instructing her to meet a clandestine visitor in the abandoned gardens, under the cover of darkness. Isolde's heart pounded with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Could it be Aldrich? Or was it a trap, a ploy by Ryland to further humiliate her, to break her spirit? She made her way to the gardens, the night air cold and damp, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds. The gardens, once a place of beauty and tranquility, were now overgrown and neglected, a reflection of the fallen state of the kingdom. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked, his face hidden in the darkness. Isolde's heart skipped a beat. It was Aldrich. He had escaped, with the help of a loyal servant, risking his life to see her, to speak to her one last time. They embraced, a desperate, clinging embrace that spoke of fear, of love, of a shared understanding that transcended words. They held each other tightly, seeking solace in each other's arms, finding a brief respite from the darkness that surrounded them. "I had to see you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his breath warm against her ear. "I had to make sure you were safe." "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice choked with tears. "It's too dangerous." "If they catch you," he silenced her with a kiss, a tender, passionate kiss that conveyed all the unspoken words, all the unacknowledged feelings that had simmered between them for so long. It was a kiss of farewell, a kiss of love, a kiss of surrender. "I love you, Isolde," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you, standing in my hall, defying me, begging for your father's life." Isolde's heart ached with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She had found love in the midst of war, in the heart of her enemy, in the crucible of betrayal and sacrifice. "I love you too, Aldrich," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have loved you despite everything, despite the hatred, the lies, the danger." They spoke for hours, sharing their fears, their hopes, their regrets. They spoke of their past, of their families, of the feud that had divided them for generations. They spoke of the future, of a world where they could be together, free from the burdens of duty and honor, free from the shadows of the past. But they both knew that future was a distant dream, a fragile hope that might never be realized. Aldrich was a fugitive, a hunted man, with a price on his head. He had to leave, to escape Ryland's grasp, to seek refuge in a distant land. As dawn approached, they parted, their hearts heavy with sorrow, their eyes filled with tears. They embraced one last time, a desperate, clinging embrace that spoke of a love that might never be, a future that was uncertain. "Go," she whispered, her hand caressing his cheek.
"Go."
"And never look back." He kissed her again, a lingering kiss that held a final goodbye. Then, turning, he vanished into the shadows of the morning mist, leaving Isolde alone with her memories, her love, and the faint, fragile hope that they might one day meet again. It was a parting stained with tears, but also with something else. Forgiveness. Chapter 19. The Queen's Decree. The weeks following Aldrich's escape were a blur of fear, uncertainty, and quiet despair for Isolde. She remained confined within the castle walls, a prisoner in all but name, her every move watched, her every conversation scrutinized. Lord Ryland, consumed by his victory and his ambition, paid her little attention, dismissing her as a harmless relic of the fallen regime. But Isolde was far from harmless. She used her confinement to her advantage, observing Ryland's court, gathering information, identifying his allies and his enemies, waiting for an opportunity to strike back, to reclaim her freedom, to avenge Aldrich's capture and escape. She discovered that Ryland's rule was brutal and oppressive, his reign marked by heavy taxation, arbitrary arrests, and widespread discontent. The people, initially welcoming of the change in leadership, were now yearning for the stability and justice of the old regime. She also learned that the Queen, though initially devastated by Barrington's betrayal and her own isolation, had not lost her cunning, her ambition, or her desire for power. She was secretly plotting her own return, seeking allies, gathering support, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Isolde saw an opportunity. She sent a secret message to the Queen through a trusted serving girl, offering her support, proposing an alliance, suggesting a plan to overthrow Ryland and restore the throne to its rightful heir. The Queen, initially suspicious, was eventually persuaded by Isolde's sincerity and the audacity of her plan. They began to communicate in secret, exchanging messages, plotting strategy, preparing for the counter-revolution. The plan was daring and dangerous, relying on the element of surprise, the loyalty of a few key individuals, and the widespread discontent among the populace. Isolde, using her knowledge of the castle, her familiarity with Ryland's routines, and her network of contacts, orchestrated the details, while the Queen, using her influence and her remaining resources, rallied support from outside the castle walls. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Ryland, emboldened by his success and growing increasingly paranoid, decided to hold a grand feast, a display of his power and his invincibility. He invited all the remaining nobles, the key figures of his regime, and even, in a gesture of arrogant confidence, Isolde herself. Isolde saw this as her chance. She used the feast as a cover, a distraction, a means to an end. She arranged for a small band of loyal soldiers, disguised as servants, to infiltrate the castle, to seize control of key positions, to capture Ryland and his allies. On the night of the feast, as the great hall was filled with music, laughter, and the clatter of dishes, Isolde gave the signal. The disguised soldiers sprang into action, attacking Ryland's guards, seizing control of the hall, capturing Ryland and his stunned allies. The coup was swift and decisive, the element of surprise overwhelming Ryland's forces. The remaining defenders, seeing the tide turn, quickly surrendered, joining the rebellion, their loyalty shifting with the changing winds of power. Ryland, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end, was imprisoned, awaiting trial for his crimes. The Queen, emerging from her seclusion, was hailed as a liberator, her return greeted with widespread rejoicing. In the aftermath of the coup, the Queen issued a royal decree restoring order, justice, and stability to the realm. She pardoned those who had been forced to serve Ryland, rewarded those who had remained loyal, and punished those who had betrayed the crown. She also issued a special decree concerning Isolde. She publicly acknowledged Isolde's role in the counter-revolution, praising her courage, her loyalty, her unwavering commitment to the realm. She restored Isolde's titles, her lands, her position at court, and, in a gesture of profound gratitude, declared her a heroine of the kingdom. But there was one more clause in the Queen's decree, a clause that sent a wave of both shock and hope through Isolde's heart. The Queen, recognizing the injustice of Aldrich's capture and his subsequent escape, declared him pardoned of all crimes, his name cleared, his honor restored. He was free to return, to reclaim his titles, his lands, his position at court. And the location of his safe return was specified, in no uncertain terms. Hymir, Isolde's ancestral home. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The news of Aldrich's pardon and the Queen's decree spread quickly, reaching Isolde before the ink was dry on the parchment. A wave of relief, of joy, of overwhelming emotion washed over her, leaving her trembling and breathless.
He was free. He was safe.
He was coming home. But amidst the joy, there was also a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of apprehension. So much had happened, So much had changed. They had both been transformed by the crucible of war, by the burdens of duty and honor, by the dangerous game they had played together. Would they still feel the same? Would their love have survived the trials and tribulations they had endured? Isolde left the capital immediately, riding with a small escort towards Hymir, her heart pounding with anticipation, her mind racing with a mixture of hope and fear. The journey was long and arduous, but she barely noticed the discomfort, her thoughts consumed by the prospect of seeing Aldrich again, of reuniting with the man she loved. As she approached Hymir, the familiar landscape unfolded before her, the rolling hills, the lush forests, the sparkling river, all bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a scene of peace, of tranquility, of homecoming, a stark contrast to the turmoil and the danger she had left behind. She reached the gates of Hymir, her ancestral home, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and longing. The guards, recognizing her, threw open the gates, welcoming her with cheers and cries of joy. She rode into the courtyard, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, searching for one face, one figure, the man who had captured her heart. And then she saw him. He was standing on the steps of the great hall, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the torches, his gray eyes fixed on her, his expression a mixture of relief, of joy, of love.
He hadn't changed.
Or perhaps he had, she realized, with a closer look. The lines of tension seemed to have lessened. The haunted look was softer now. Isolde dismounted, her legs trembling beneath her, her heart pounding against her ribs. She walked towards him, her steps slow and hesitant, her gaze locked with his. They met halfway, standing in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the cheering crowd, but oblivious to everything but each other. They said nothing. No words were needed. They simply looked at each other, their eyes conveying all the unspoken emotions, all the unacknowledged feelings, all the love and longing that had sustained them through the darkness. Then he reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his touch gentle, tender, sending a jolt of warmth through her. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the moment, the reunion, the culmination of all that they had endured. He drew her closer, his arms encircling her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers. They stood there for a long moment, embraced, reunited, their love rekindled, their bond stronger than ever. The cheers of the crowd faded into the background, the world around them disappearing, leaving only the two of them, their love, their future. "Welcome home," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his breath warm against her ear. "I am home," she replied, her voice choked with tears, her heart overflowing with joy. They finally broke apart, their eyes meeting, their hands still clasped together. They had survived. They had overcome. They had found their way back to each other. But now, a new challenge awaited them. A reckoning of the past, a rebuilding of trust, a forging of a new future, together. They had each made hard choices, and many of them. And now, they had to face them as one. The duty, the love, the reckoning. It was all here at Hymir. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of love, the power of forgiveness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Isolde and Aldrich, reunited at Hymir, embarked on a new chapter of their lives, a chapter defined not by war and betrayal, but by peace, reconciliation, and a shared commitment to building a better future. They married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by family and friends, their vows echoing the deep bond they had forged, the love that had survived the trials and tribulations of their past. They rebuilt Hymir, restoring its former glory, transforming it into a haven of peace and prosperity, a symbol of their enduring love. They worked tirelessly to heal the wounds of the war, to reconcile the warring factions, to unite the kingdom under a banner of justice and compassion. They established a new council, comprised of representatives from all corners of the realm, ensuring that all voices were heard, all needs were met. They ruled wisely and justly, their reign marked by a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. They became known as the just rulers, their names whispered with reverence and respect throughout the land. Isolde, no longer the naive, sheltered lady-in-waiting, had blossomed into a strong, confident, and compassionate leader. She used her influence to champion the cause of the weak and the vulnerable, to promote education and the arts, to create a society where justice and equality prevailed. Aldrich, freed from the burdens of his past, the weight of his family's feud, had found peace and contentment in his love for Isolde and his service to the realm. He remained a warrior at heart, but his strength was now tempered with wisdom and compassion, his loyalty guided by a deep sense of justice. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' strength, their intelligence, their compassion. They raised them with love and understanding, teaching them the importance of duty, honor, and forgiveness. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome, the price they had paid for their love and their freedom. But those scars did not define them. They were a testament to their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other and to the realm. As the years turned into decades, Isolde and Aldrich grew old together, their love deepening with each passing day, their bond unbreakable. They walked hand in hand through the gardens of Hymir, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, their hearts filled with gratitude for the life they had shared, the love they had found, the legacy they had created. And as they sat, looking out, one asked, "Was it worth it?" And the other, placing a hand over that one, answered, "Every moment." They had faced death, but now, together, they had chosen life. The end.